Hey everybody, this is Ian O'Byrne. We're coming to you with another episode of the Literacy Research Association Research to Practice series of shows. This is episode 18. In these recent episodes, we're taking a bit of a pivot. In the first 2 years of the show, we would focus on fields of research and look at literacy researchers in the field, talk about what they're doing, and then figure out what that means for teaching and learning. And working with students in the classroom. In this recent iteration of the show, we're teamed up with the Literacy Research Theory, Method, and Practice journal. So what has been affectionately known as the yearbook over the years, we're taking research from the yearbook, from LRTMP, and bringing on the scholars. So what that means for you is that these are pieces of research that have been accepted to present at the conference. Then after they present at the conference, the scholars resubmit their work and they're accepted into the journal. So one of the nice things is that we're getting very, very high quality work from great scholars. So we're focusing on great scholars in the field, thinking about the work they're doing, and then having time to talk with the scholars to figure out what does this mean, and having a little bit of a panel discussion to figure out what the implications are. So enough chitter-chatter about this. Want to take a look at who is involved in the panel and have them introduce themselves. Brianna, can you introduce yourself first?
Absolutely. So my name is Brianna Ronan. I am an assistant professor at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, and I'll be presenting my paper, which I presented at LRA last year and will be in the journal. And it's titled Intertextuality and Dialogic Interaction in Students' Online Text Construction. And I'm so excited to be part of this panel and to share my work, and also to share the work that I've been doing with Joanne Kleifkin, who is my colleague at Teachers College, which is my dissertation advisor. And we worked on a really great project together, which is called Steps to Literacy. And that's where this research comes from that we'll be talking about today.
Very
Joanne,
cool.
Want to share, introduce yourself?
Yeah, Joanne, go ahead.
Sure. I'm Joanne Kleifkin. I'm now Professor Emerita from Teachers College, and very proud to see my very last doctoral student shine as she's going to be doing today and has always done. So I'll just leave it at that, and we'll move on to the next introduction.
Very cool. Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle Hegerman, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. And I'm really happy to be participating in the conversation today. Thanks for the invitation again.
Thank you. Last but not least, Michael.
Hi, my name is Mike DeSchrijver. I'm an assistant professor at Central Michigan University, and I would also extend thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Very cool. So once again, one of the things that Brianna brought up initially is that this research is nested within other research that's being conducted. So all along the way, they'll help partial that out for us and explain how these intersect and possibly some of the bigger themes. So the piece that was accepted and that we'll talk about is called Intertextuality and Dialogic Interaction in Students' Online Text Construction. Brianna, what does that mean? Can you make it simpler for us to understand just what it's all about?
Right, that's a great question. So what this paper and what our research is really about is trying to understand how students, and this particular work is focused around adolescent emergent bilinguals. Emergent bilinguals are also known as English learners in schools. They are students who are, through the process of learning English, becoming bilingual because of their home language skills already. So we are really interested in how emergent bilingual students make sense of different types of multimodal materials in their reading and writing process, and then how they construct meaning from those different types of multimodal texts. So that's where this notion of intertextuality comes from, is bringing different texts together, bringing parts of different texts, bring different pieces together and making sense of one's world. So that's really the theme of our work, and we can start. Would it be best to start talking about a little bit about the conceptual framework of where this notion of intertextuality comes from?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge. It's unpacking, we have different types of students and how they make sense of, and across these texts. But the challenge is, what do you mean by, as researchers, what do we mean by text? What do we mean by intertextuality? How do we integrate that social process? So what does that all mean?
Right. So for our work, we really consider text as more than just a written product. And that's very much in the Hallidaean tradition, in which you're thinking about all of the different materials in an educational environment that are used to make meaning. So for our purposes, we're really looking at not just written documents. For example, in a unit that we had about the civil rights unit that our 8th grade students looked at, we were looking at historic documents like the speech by Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech, but we were also looking at a lot of multimedia materials that students had to make sense with. So we had a video of Martin Luther King delivering his speech. We had images that students had to look at the period of segregation, and they had to make sense of all these different historical materials in order to develop an understanding of this particular moment in history, and then be able to construct an understanding in a written form. So we're looking at text broadly, beyond just the written product. Images, videos, charts, audios, website, physical objects. These are all texts that students have to make sense of.
Is it a challenge to work with students, and one of my questions is it a challenge to work with students but also work with educators to think broadly about text? Where was this situated? Where was this research conducted?
Great question. So this research was conducted in New York City public schools, and I don't know that it was a challenge necessarily for teachers to start thinking about text in this larger sense, because they are doing this work every day when they are constructing their own units and their own modules of instruction. They know that, particularly in social studies, you are relying a lot on visual materials. So I can give you just a short or an image which reflects some of the different types of materials that our students and our teachers had to use. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how this works. But it wasn't hard, I don't think, for the teachers to really see these things as text. Joanne, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Well, you got posted here the Voloshinov quote, and I was going to elaborate by talking about the fact that the notion of dialogism, or human social interaction, is all part of what Brianna was explaining. So I thought I'd call attention to two important figures whose thinking has influenced us, me also, as in my whole career as a linguist and researcher and educator. And the first one is Valentin Voloshinov. So if you want to put that quote up, I can say a few words about that, Brianna. Is that up?
Do you see it?
Yes, okay. So he says that language acquires life and historically evolves precisely here in concrete verbal communication and not in the abstract linguistic system of language forms, nor in the individual psyche of speakers. And he goes on to say there's no such thing as word without evaluative accent. So to unpack that, he was the linguist member of the Bakhtin Circle, and he argued that language, and more specifically the utterance, is the primordial vehicle of human social interaction with all these other sign systems that Brianna was speaking of, including text and visual and audio and so forth. It is the primordial vehicle of human social interaction, and when he talks about concrete verbal communication, he talks about the construction of meaning as something that's social dialogic and evaluative. And evaluative, with that notion of evaluative accent, he signals that nothing we say or do is neutral, and that our speech, our social interaction together, our actions together, when we talk, we're full of intonations and word choices and even syntactic structure choices, for that matter. So that all of the referential meanings, these texts that students have to interpret and so on, is molded by this notion of evaluation, and change of meaning is reevaluation. And that kind of brings us to the work of Jean Lave, who focuses more on learning with that same point of view. And so, do we have that quote?
I do.
Just really quick. I'll start just reading it. Knowledge and learning will be found distributed throughout the complex structure of persons acting in setting. They cannot be pinned down to the head of the individual, or to assigned tasks, or to external tools, or to the environment, but lie instead in the relations among them. So you can translate that to what we're thinking of in terms of task activities and social interaction around new media.
Right.
So this is anthropologist Jean Lave. She argues that knowledge is constructed socially and occurs in all kinds of situations. And so that's
Here's
something
an
that we
example.
took into account.
Oh, sorry, Joanne.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, here's the example. It took me a while to find it, but here's the example of all the different texts that we consider in the classroom. They include images, they include written documents, they include oral speech, right, verbal speech that students enact while they're trying to make sense of the text. And so I think it's not necessarily selecting or viewing text as multiple forms that's challenging. What can be challenging is the construction part, right? Is bringing these together, and that's where the learning happens, just as Joanne just mentioned, and that's where a lot of our work as researchers and a lot of our professional development with teachers is centered around, is how to foster and support a learning environment that allows for for students to be able to interpret these texts, synthesize these texts, and really understand how they come together in making meaning.
And just a final point before we move to the next section or have a discussion is that for us, going to think about the optimal research context for understanding learning, we think that it is situations of persons speaking and acting in concert. So a key research methodology path for us is really close observation and analysis of their speaking and acting while working with all of these objects that are presented to them, and that you will see in Brianna's research.
Yeah, so I just wanted to end maybe that conceptual piece by bringing in the work of Kress and Idema, who look at the movement of meaning across different types of modes. So modes here are these different types of visual media, written forms, oral speech, and how when we construct meaning, it's not necessarily about the product alone that we're constructing meaning around, but the social process in which those products are embedded and created. And so when we look at figuring out how do we research that, how do we as researchers go in and analyze this multimodal process, this transformative process, we have to think about capturing data in very different ways than we have typically done in literacy research. But before we go into the research section, I guess I'd be interested to hear what others have thought and what they see as their contributions to doing this work of intertextuality and literacy research.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. Mike, quick question.
I have just a couple questions, I guess, related. First, going back to the discussion about intertextual interactions and intertextual meaning construction. As I was reading through the paper and then looking up a little bit of the background on Holliday's perspective on intertextuality, it made me wonder if there's any use in trying to differentiate what might be termed kind of foundational intertextual links versus constructed intertextual links. So there seems to me that kind of the chain of texts that go into producing any given text, and then there's the intertextual links that the learner constructs as they're navigating through multiple texts. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's any use in thinking about those in two separate ways, or if there's enough overlap that we just consider them all, intertextual interactions.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think I think it would be hard for me to imagine a foundational link without without thinking about the learner, right? Because there's always interpretation that has to happen. The learner or the reader or whoever it is, the user of this material, has to make sense of it. So I don't believe that the text itself carries meaning unless, and so that comes a lot from Bakhtin, and that comes a lot from this notion of Voloshinov brings to us, that the text itself doesn't have meaning without the reader, without the learner, without the speaker. So it would be hard for me to separate the two. But it is a good question.
Okay, and one other quick question while I've got the mic here. As you're talking about the transductions, translation, and shifts and so forth, it seems to me, as I've been working with that there's a lot of assumption built into the learning discussions of those, that's always a positive shift or a positive transduction. But it seems to me that moving from a sophisticated text to an image, there's the possibility that students in particular, especially at lower developmental levels, might lose something or be overly reductive. And I just wondered what you thought about that and how we can account for that in research and in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also something that Chris has written about, in that it's not necessarily the learner that, because of their developmental skills or writing skills or interpretive skills, but it's the limitations and the constraints of the boundaries of the mode. So that's where I think maybe there are differences, and it's modal constrictions rather than constrictions of the learner. Although we have seen examples when we have students look at different videos, look at different images, particularly for emergent bilinguals, it is difficult, it is a challenge to put those into words, right? They can respond immediately to images, and putting them into English, academic English, can be challenging. And so that's where they need additional supports, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Could I just add something quickly? It was an interesting distinction that you made, Mike, and I think of these as multimodal resources, as semiotic resources that people draw on. And another resource that people draw on, students draw on their teachers for guidance, so that the interpretation, if it tends to go awry, they can be guided into thinking differently. So you don't want to forget that it's people acting in concert, including the instructor or the peer learner, who may either misguide or guide, as Brianna might be showing us, the direction for making meaning in this learning context.
Right, and we saw that a number of times where we're working with newcomer students sometimes who do not have the contextual understanding of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, right? So when they look at images without knowing the historical context of them, they could be misinterpreted easily. So that's the role of the teacher. The teacher is never absent from this interaction. The teacher is embedded in the process of intertextuality.
Actually, can I jump in with a question?
Of course.
Thank you. So that is something that I found absolutely, really engaging in the paper, and it raised a lot of questions for me. The lens that you're using on intertextuality is really new for me, and so I would love just to ask for a minute, because in that interchange that you shared in the paper between the student who really wasn't able to make any kind of inference from the text, right, about the laws or the rules around segregation, there was the teacher, right, the text support person, who was there to sort of provide some context. So would it sort of, in using this sort of lens, would you say then that the teacher's background knowledge itself was a text?
Absolutely.
Do we say that so that what the teacher brings to that conversation and the way that she, I suppose, engage in a process of re-semiotization, right? So there's a schema in her mind. She produces this text for the student, and it either is understood or it's not understood, but that itself, the background knowledge, would be considered text.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is part of the intertextual process. The re-semiotization process is moving from that oral text that's produced, the verbal text, oral text that the teacher produces, into a written form as well.
Right.
And that is quite challenging for emergent bilinguals when that oral text is produced in English, right?
Absolutely.
And they have to process that and interpret that in their own ways. And we found it is really helpful the home language students is involved in writing the home language, the text in their home language, or whether the students have a moment or a part of in the construction process to do that work in their home language.
Yeah, exactly. So I can imagine then that I don't know if you saw this in your data, but there would have been sort of a negotiation potentially right around those texts of the students providing their own sort of understanding, limited or not limited, potentially in both languages, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That helps me to kind of orient my thinking a little bit. So I do appreciate that very much.
Now, I'm glad you unpacked it, because it's, as Brianna said, like, you have students, this is a social process, and so the students are trying to make sense and create and construct, and at the same time, it's almost like that understanding at times is mediated by that schema that the teacher brings in, or the support person. And so where is that intersection, Brianna and Joanne, can you take us into your research? Can you give us a better understanding? The materials are all in the show notes for viewers. We will share out these resources and many more resources to help follow along. But can you walk us through, what happened in the research?
So I guess that's something that I should start with, is by way of very brief introduction to set the stage for Brianna to go in much greater detail, but to say that for the last 28 or so years at Teachers College, we meaning, with other faculty and graduate students and teams, have carried out research on social interaction with a focus on, number one, emergent bilinguals, and number two, the influence of new media on their interactions wherever they are, in schools and workplaces. So, and we've tried to figure out people's ways of learning by looking very closely at these communicative practices and actions while they're completing tasks. So, some research we did on multilingual worker actions in a high-tech workplace in the Silicon Valley involved people on the assembly floor speaking all different languages, Vietnamese, Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and how they brought to bear their native languages along with the English, which was the lingua franca, on solving problems at these machines when they broke down, for example. But mostly, students and my colleagues and I at Teachers College have been examining what learning looks like during participant interactions in classrooms. And so that's an example of that is our STEPS project, the large project that lasted about 4.5 years. And this is where Brianna's research comes in. And interestingly, if you think back on Leiv's notion of informal learning that exists everywhere, and we saw learning in the workplace study, for example, is that the school social interaction can also be the site of informal learning, the sub rosa kind of learning among peers that takes place in classrooms. And something very interesting that we and teachers also can understand a little bit better as we look very closely at these concerted actions using the kind of technology that Brianna will talk about to be able to capture that. So I'll just leave it at that and let Brianna fill in some more details.
Thanks, Joanne. So our project, our Steps to Literacy project, the larger grant, what it did was help us to create a online writing platform for emergent bilingual students. And the writing platform was used primarily in the content areas of science and social studies, but could be used in other content areas as well. And what it did was we had different units that were constructed through collaboration with teachers for 8th graders. It was based on New York State standards, content area standards, and writing standards. And what we did was create units in social studies, in civil rights, science, in evolution, and I feel like there was another one in there, Joanne. But
well, another civil rights one was the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, that's right. And in each of these units, we created these multimodal resources that students could draw upon in supporting their written work. So the online platform had places to take notes on these resources, to tag the notes, analyze them according to different perspectives, which we called the STEPS lenses. And I can show that with you real quick. The STEPS lenses encourages students to look at different materials from social, technological, economic, political, scientific, and geographic perspective, and in doing so, bring a larger understanding of either an event in social studies or a particular concept in science, bring a larger understanding of it, and help synthesize information from across a variety of different perspectives. So in our social studies unit, as I showed you all before, there were a number of different texts that students had to analyze and look at through these different lenses. And in the paper, I focus on the lens of political, which is quite a challenging lens for students who have never been asked to think about political scenarios before, but are touched by them every day. So as soon as you talk about the role of power with emergent bilingual students, they immediately start understanding what political is all about, laws and restrictions. And so in our research, or in this paper specifically, I was interested in seeing how when emergent bilingual peers come together around the task of understanding social studies, and specifically the U.S. Civil Rights Unit, how do they construct their understanding of this event or this moment in time? And in doing so, I can show you a little bit about the data collection methods that we use, which were important to tracing meaning making across these different modes. So the data collection in this paper focused really on 4 focal students here. This is their regular social studies classroom that they have their classes in. This is a one-to-one computing environment with the website that students, or the writing platform that students engaged with. And our data that we collected included video recordings of the students. So as you can see in the screenshot there, that's a view of the video camera that we used to record the students. And we had about 3 video cameras set up in different parts of the classroom in order to see the students from all perspectives, because that's very important when you're looking at social interaction among peers and between teachers and students. You need to see all of the players, so that it requires a lot of camera. Other data sources included the screen capture recording, so we recorded all of the data from their screens, because we really wanted to see what is it that they're looking at when they're talking, because it's not enough just to see who they're talking to, but you have to see the context in which they're talking. So we captured all of their screen recordings, and then also all of the written work that they produced. And in doing so, we have a lot of different types of data. The difficulty now comes into how do you merge all of these data forms together and analyze them, because you can have the video of people interacting and analyze that separate from what's going on the screen, but that's not actually how interaction works. So how we addressed that issue is we used Elan, which is a linguistic annotator, to analyze both the video screen recordings, or the screenshot recordings, as well as the video recordings. And we were able to create transcriptions of students' spoken work, their spoken and gestural interactions, their written work, their online use of the system materials, so those multimodal resources, and any other types of system navigation, whether that was going out to other websites or going to, there's a message function within the website where students could send messages to one another, so the interaction wasn't just restricted to oral interaction, but it was also written interactions and text. So we were able to transcribe those across a common timeline, which was extremely helpful in order to see how these interactions cross these modes. And then from there, I created these multimodal transcripts, which allow us to see students' spoken and gestural communication as it unfolds along with their written work and their online navigation. So here's a screenshot of an example of a multimodal transcription. On the left-hand side, you have one student, R. His spoken and gestural interactions, contributions. J is the next column. That's the second student, her spoken and gestural interactions. Then in this particular transcript, I'm really focusing on her written work. So you have the written text as it unfolds. And then on the last column, the online navigation. So whenever there's a change in her screen, because she opens up a new resource, then there's another embedded image of how the navigation, how she used the online navigation tools. So creating these multimodal transcripts is what really allows for, I would argue, the researcher to look at social interaction. Because without that, you can't really see the process of making meaning. All you see is the actual product. If you just focus on the written text, if you just focus on the note that the student is producing, you miss all of the meaning-making process. And so in order to capture that, you have to involve the focus, the unit of your analysis, is the interaction between people. So those are kind of the methodological questions that we had coming to this task and how we resolve them. But there's a lot of work going on in a number of places by a number of grade scholars looking at how do you capture this data. And there are ways of representing it in many ways, and this is how we represented it here.
I love the data collection and making sense of that data. I earlier was working on the TICA grant, with my colleagues from UConn and Clemson, and we were looking at students in online reading comprehension, and we were looking at, we had screen capture software looking at work that they were conducting in the different placements, but part of the challenge is that, you have 25 students sitting in a classroom together. We are in an economically challenged area. You got 25 kids on MacBooks together. We knew that they were hacking the system to send messages on Bonjour. We know that they're looking to each other. We know that students are very good at, hiding or shading what they're doing as opposed to what they're not doing. And so we have some video that we've written a lot about, and I've published stuff on, looking at what students are doing and the talk, and how they share and how they collaborate, but we didn't do a good job really capturing that. At least I don't think we did. Mike, question?
Yeah, I just had a couple quick questions. You mentioned when describing this online system that it accommodated tags, and I wondered if you guys used tags during the activities that the students did, and if so, if you felt like I love the data analysis she did, the multi-leveled, and how it looks at the social piece, but I wonder to the extent that tags might be able to help us see some of those intertextual links that are being made by either implied or direct connections between the text. And then my second question is, in talking about all this, the discussion is about meaning making, which to me seems it's focused on the either implied or direct meaning of all the text that we're looking at. And I wondered if across the data that you looked at there was ever insights that emerged that were kind of beyond the text, beyond the meaning that's in there? So I guess two kind of separate questions there.
Sure. The first question I'll actually have Joanne answer because she's done a lot of work with our designer of the website and our programmer to create a back end of the system, which allows researchers to track how students tag different notes and how they make connections between different images. Joanne, do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
I can mention some of this. The back end part of the system allowed us to capture a lot of the student work, and one was a data visualizer, which allowed us to see at what time, at any given moment, what was open on the screen and who was talking at that time. So we could get a visual impression. I don't think we have that at hand to show you, to get a visual impression of, so it was a kind of tagging because they were color-coded and we could see what was happening at each moment, but everything that was happening at every given moment. And then we also...
Sorry. It creates an enormous amount of data, which can be overwhelming at times for the researcher.
No.
And how you make sense of all of that tagging and all of that intertextuality, that's quite the challenge, I think, for us.
Yeah. And that's data that's ongoing and analyzed now. My colleague Chuck did some really interesting analysis of another aspect of the back end part of the software, which was to look at, for example, the number of times students drew on certain kinds of semiotic resources. To what extent were they looking at text? To what extent were they looking at images? To what extent videos, and so on. And also, we looked at the number of times that students themselves who were asked to do this tagged these resources as one of the steps features. So that was another kind of coding that they themselves provided for us. What were they thinking about? What perspective were they did they have in mind as they began to look and talk together and then take notes on what they were examining? Mm-hmm. So those are some of the quote-unquote tags or codes that we were able to capture. Even though we didn't have a huge giant N, we had multiple N's throughout the 4 years, and as this back end was being developed, we were able more and more to capture a very deep knowledge of the individual N work using the system. So I guess that's something that merits a paper in itself, which we hope will be coming out soon in a volume.
Okay. Great.
But thanks for that. Was a good question.
Yeah. And then for your second question, actually the tagging really made some of that, the issue of what are these other intertextual links that students are making that are not ones that we had anticipated based on the types of text that we produced. When we had students look at certain things from a social or economic or political perspective, that's when students a lot of times brought their own text, their own prior knowledge as text, which I argue is a really important text to recognize. We started the Civil Rights Unit with a video anchor on immigrant rights, which for emergent bilingual students is something that they recognize, something that they live, something that's part of their experiences. And so they were able to make connections in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate between their perspectives as immigrant youth to the perspectives of African Americans during the 1960s and segregation. We talked about desegregation in schools, and then they'd often say, well, I look around my classroom and I don't see any white people. So where is desegregation today in New York City and the Bronx? And those were these types of intertextual processes that we really encourage students to bring up and to make.
Michelle, any comments, questions?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, so many ideas sort of going through my mind. I think sort of methodologically, I really did relate to that, to the process of sort of tracking the multiple sort of inputs essentially and outputs, right? As a logistical issue. So I'm actually really thinking about ELAN and its potential. Because of my own work, I guess I tried to trace sort of the origin, right, of an idea from background knowledge through to written product, and didn't use this system, but have been sort of grappling with some of these methodological questions about how do we, track, and how do you put all of that on a common timeline so that you can really analyze the way that meaning gets constructed. And I guess if I use sort of this lens of sort of remediation or sort of semiotization, that's exactly what I was looking at, right? So, I cobbled together a different system using Moray, screen capture, which had sort of video, picture-in-picture video.
Right.
I could see the dyads engage sort of together, but the one piece that was very hard for me to I guess code or to analyze was that construction of meaning, right? So when two interlocutors are engaged in a conversation, right, how do you then represent, right, that co-construction? How do you know that that was the place or the provenance or the origin of that idea that maybe shows up later in a written piece of work?
Right.
So I like very much sort of this way of really just tracking, right, those dialogic moves, because then we might then be able to show evidence of learning directly related to that dialogue.
Yeah, I can relate to that challenge, because sometimes you are trying to make something visible that is not there, that is not immediately there. So you have to look right to the actions that come later, and then there's you have to look for connections, and sometimes those connections are quite obvious. And sometimes those connections are a little tenuous, and you're not quite sure, and so you have to make some decisions about how much you can really argue is representative of intertextual meaning making, and how much of it is perhaps a different type of meaning making. I'm not sure, but it's a great question.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's the burden of proof, right? I mean, you have to be able to say, yep, that's exactly where that idea came from, so that I can code it in a certain way later on. So, I think this definitely opens up some possibilities, so thank you for that.
Well, it's such a challenge to be able to look at this meaning construction and, capture across these hybrid spaces. These ideas could be constructed, individually. We don't know what's happening online as students connect. We don't know what happens when students connect with the teacher. I was in a webinar last night talking about a MOOC and lurkers in a MOOC, and they basically, a lot of the facilitators were upset because they said, well, we don't know if things are happening right then and there, but we don't know what students are gaining just by being in that process and in that environment, and it might churn ideas that they might build up later. So Brianna, what are your big takeaways from this research? Like, what are the big themes, or what motivates you as you walk out of this? What did you learn?
So I work now in a teacher preparation credentialing program at Cal Poly, and so I work really with future teachers, pre-service teachers, And I try to get them to think about, well, first thinking about their emergent bilingual students, which is really important, but thinking about how they can understand their students' meaning-making process and not limit themselves to just looking at the student's final written piece of work, which is something that is natural, right? It's natural for teachers to want to show progress through products. And it's something that there's a lot of pressure on them to do based on state requirements, based on standardized testing. So it's trying to get them to say, yes, that's all important, but if we don't recognize a lot of the meaning making happens prior to, you know, that time where they're sitting down and writing, then you're missing a lot of opportunities to support student. So for me, process over product. Thank you, Ian. A lot of what I do with coming from this research is getting my pre-service teachers to allow for their students to interact with one another in the classroom and to use their home language, and for collaborative writing projects that is not new pedagogy, but I think particularly with certain demands in curriculum and certain demands in standardized testing, has gone away a little bit. So that's what I try to get my students to look at. And I think, and to some extent in California, we have new standards for English language learners that really foster this type of work. Before, the standards were very language focused and really focused primarily on accuracy in production of academic English. And it was usually taught isolated from the content area. Now it's integrated in the content area. You have to, as a teacher, focus on academic English development in the content area, and you have to do it through meaningful and interactive ways with students. And I think all of this work that we did on the SEPS project really allows for that to happen. So that's what I try to get my students to think about, is when they're working with emergent bilinguals, think about all of the ways that they're going to need to make meaning in order to construct a written text.
When you're working with emergent bilinguals, English language learners, this idea of multimodal construction, of meaning making, are there any special things that happen in that interaction? You know, as opposed to just meaning making in the classroom and just multimodal construction, is there something special when we bring in that other lens of having a student that is a second language user?
You do. You see a lot of amazing, really dynamic language play. In Joanne's work, she and Ofelia Garcia use this term TransLanguaging. And that is what you see in emergent bilinguals' work every day. It is part of how they make sense of their world. And TransLanguaging is this use of their language resources. So in our particular students' context, that was English and Spanish. And it's more than just code switching, going back between languages, right? In spoken interaction. It's also using languages across different types of modes. So we have students, and I encourage my students to present students with a text in English, but then have them discuss that text in Spanish, or have them, or vice versa, right? So it gets them to develop their language skills across both productive and receptive abilities, or productive and receptive modes of communication. But it also makes them, I think, really fuller. It helps them demonstrate their real full repertoire of languages. And for teachers who work in English only or English restricted environments, they don't get to see that if it's not allowed. And in the case that, in my paper that I wrote about, the classroom or the school had a ESL program. the teachers themselves were not bilingual. At least in this case, there were a couple of other bilingual teachers in the school, but in this case, their social studies teacher was not a bilingual teacher, but the students still engaged in translanguaging. And that's part of that, the student informal learning practices is you use the resources that you need to use in order to make sense of the world. And I think that's the exciting part of working with emergent bilinguals, is it allows for that type of dynamic use of language.
And could I add one thing to what Brianna said here is that the actual STEP system itself brought the other language as a resource choice for students. And we had at the end of, towards the end of the project, 2 of our teachers volunteered actually to try to create their own units and then implement them in their classrooms. And one of the things that they and students have said all along was that they liked that bilingual option in STEPS because they thought that every time students returned to a given document, they would be increasing their exposure to both not just content knowledge but linguistic knowledge as well. And it also encouraged and motivated them, as Brianna was saying. So that shuttling between Spanish and English with either across modes or within the spoken mode happened pretty smoothly. But it did happen differently because because of different levels of English. One of the 2 teachers that worked with us at the end and developed the classes themselves, one was a teacher of ESL students. So he was the ESL teacher in his class in the 8th grade. In the other school, it was the bilingual teacher working with newcomers. So the way the 2 languages manifested themselves differed in those situations. And there's a lot of complexity, as those of you who do teacher education work know. You can't make some blanket statement about how to teach teachers to work with kids. It has that complexity among many, many others that we can talk about if there's time.
Mike, Michelle?
Well, I was just going to add a comment, actually, that this work, as you were talking, I was just thinking back to some sort of really fundamental sort of theoretical frames in some language acquisition, right? So just thinking about comprehensible input, right? And how do we construct environments where, right, teachers and learners sort of have opportunities to communicate, right, to have access to information that is comprehensible, but maybe a little bit beyond sort of a reach. I think that that framing sort of all of the modes that you identify in your paper, I think really can give teachers access, right, to just enabling comprehension, and enabling communication, and privileging not just, one mode of communication over another. I think is really fundamental. The university that I work in is actually a bilingual university. We do everything all of the time in French and English. And, right, so what you're saying exactly, these ways of communicating, oh gosh, I mean, it's just such a part of this place where I live, and I think that to the extent that we can create learning environments for bilingual children, right, that privilege, there are many ways of making meaning. I just think it's great. It's really, really great.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, you're welcome.
As you said, it's for bilinguals and for emergent bilinguals, it is daily life. Using these languages, and to create educational environments that don't recognize that, that don't allow that to happen, is not only limiting. I think I argue it's a fundamental right that they have, right? It's a linguistic right, it's a human right that they have to use all of the resources available to them. And so that's all of the work that we do in teacher ed and teacher prep is allowing our future educators to recognize that and create environments that allow that to happen.
Should say that that's nothing new under the sun in a way. Dewey taught us that a long time ago.
Absolutely.
We use what the student brings to the classroom. That's a resource.
Mike, any questions about the teaching and learning and implications for the classroom?
Yeah, so my head is just buzzing. And, I have limited and no experience with bilingual students, but I'm wondering, so I'm cheating a little bit here. I'm going to steal an idea from Michelle. So we've got a kind of a back channel notepad going here, and she wrote something during this session about the possibility of online research buddies. And because I appreciate all of the focus on the social interaction in the classrooms, but my work tends to focus on what's happening when somebody's alone in front of their computer at night, or even alone in front of their computer at school, or increasingly in hybrid classes or whatever. So I wonder to what extent, in a bilingual setting like that, an online research buddy for those times when they are alone in front of their computer, but matching them with somebody who is not an English as a second language learner as their online research buddy, what sort of meaning making might result from that, and what support in an open web environment as opposed to more of a closed system like you guys are working with, what sort of supports would be needed for both participants in that sort of environment?
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely something that we encourage because that's where the interaction happens. And in the paper, I present the work of two students working together, one of which is a newcomer and one of which is still an emergent bilingual student, still receives ESL services, but has been in the school system longer and has a more proficient level of English. In interacting, each one brings something really interesting to the table, and our newcomer is new to this context, new to this topic, but she had a pretty solid understanding of Spanish academic writing. Not perfect, but a more solid use of Spanish than our other student did. He had, with the context, he understood the subject, and he could help her construct things in English, but they both brought, I think, a deeper understanding of the material when they worked together. So I think that's something that, for working with emergent bilingual students, you have to build in. Some of the difficulties with doing that is an over-reliance on it. When you have proficient English students or you have native English speakers always being matched up with the emergent bilingual student, and it's something that can be taxing for them, and it's not something that would necessarily, well, it's challenging. I see a lot of times teachers say, okay, you and you work together, and then they're stuck together for like the whole project, and the native English speaker or the more proficient English speaker gets really frustrated, and your emergent bilingual gets really frustrated as well, because they have to work with someone who doesn't really want to help with them. So it's trying to find the right pairs and trying to balance proficiencies, and having emergent bilinguals work together is really powerful as well. So you don't have to have the language model, right? Because there is no real native language model anyway. So.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you for unpacking that. It's been a wonderful experience to talk through the work. I think there's a lot of guidance for not only English language learners, but unpacking and constructing and making with multimodal content. I also think there's a lot that we can learn by looking at the data collection and the research questions and how we make sense of all that. This is, as researchers and educators, we need to spend more time thinking about those different spaces and collecting data across those spaces and figure out how those interactions affect what's happening in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the horn and have everyone basically give their last thoughts, any big questions that they have, say a general goodbye. While you're getting your ideas in order, I want to remind everyone that this is a production of the Literacy Research Association. What we've been doing is taking pieces that have been accepted and presented at the conference, are ultimately published in the Literacy Research Theory, Method, and Practice Journal, which takes the best of the best, and we spend time with the researchers to talk about their work and figure out what the implications are in the classroom and then also outside the classroom. So Brianna, you were the head on this piece, so you want to have last words? What are the big questions that you're left with?
Thank you. First, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to engage in this conversation and to give me some really important questions to think about. For some of the questions that I have going forward are some of the ones that Michelle and Michael brought up about how do we really recognize when connections are being made between and across texts. As a researcher, how can I make some of that visible when it isn't necessarily caught on camera, right? And I think to go back to Michael's question about we are making some assumptions about the text that we provide students to interact with, right? We have certain interpretations that we deem the correct interpretation of that text. So what happens when students bring a different interpretation or bring a different text to the foreground with that? How do we reconcile that with the fact that we are teaching them, right? That we are wanting them to get it in the sense that there is an accepted version of this interpretation that they will be tested on, or that will maybe limit their access to a particular type of program, or that particularly for emergent bilinguals, I think about that all the time. So those are a lot of the questions that I have now to think about, and I appreciate you all helping me get there with them. So thank you so much.
Not a problem. Thank you, Joanne.
Well, just a quick thanks to everyone for this invitation, and courage to all of you who are continuing your wonderful research, trying to help teachers realize their dreams of helping students realize theirs. Thank you.
Well said. Mike?
I just, again, extend my thanks to the authors on this, and they've changed the way that I think about two particular things. One is the role of background knowledge, which I struggled with in trying to deal with exploring synthesis for meaning and creative synthesis in my works, and I think I have a whole new way of looking at that. And the other is kind of a new lens on this idea of the transformation and the shifts that happen when you go from one mode to another. And I guess one of the things that occurred to me here that I'd like to explore more, both in my classes and my research, is how we can use the task itself. And not put too many demands on the students or the participants, but to use the task itself to make their thinking more explicit, either through things like tags or just documentation or process blogs or whatever. There's obviously a balance line in there somewhere that we can find that we're getting better data and they're learning more without overwhelming them. And I think that's a great open question for what's happened, to try and unpack what's happening inside the head.
Well said, Michelle.
Thanks. Yeah, and well, Mike absolutely articulated very clearly how I'm also thinking about this. It's not surprising. Mike and I have, done some thinking in the past together. So the background knowledge piece, to me, in so many ways, it's coming to me in so many different ways to think about the importance of background knowledge and really sort of identifying it as a text is very helpful to me. So that was a new way of thinking about something that I've been thinking about myself, going around in my echo chamber of my own mind. So that's super helpful. And I think I also have sort of new ways of talking about this work with my own students in teacher education programs. So I say thank you for that. And thirdly, I would like to think about the open web, right? So just like you said, Brian, like the texts that students were reading or engaging with, were selected, right, for the purpose of the research. But in terms of sort of the ecological validity, right, of the experiences that our students have, I think that's a really important new direction for all of us to be thinking about as well. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you again, all. Thank you for spending a good hour with us to talk about some great work. And we'll see you all on the next episode of Literacy Research Association Research to Practice.